The sky above Germany was a gray battlefield of smoke and fire. The bomber shook under the pounding of anti-aircraft shells, every explosion lighting the clouds in harsh orange bursts. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant John C. Morgan gripped the controls of the B-17 Flying Fortress and tried to steady the aircraft as it lurched in the air. The smell of burning oil filled his lungs. Behind him, men shouted over the roar of engines that no longer sounded healthy. It was supposed to be another routine raid, but now, survival was the only mission left. Morgan had trained for chaos. He had been a steady hand under pressure from the day he joined the Army Air Forces. Friends remembered him as calm, polite, and disciplined, a man who rarely raised his voice, even in emergencies. Yet no amount of discipline could prepare him for what was about to happen that day, in the summer of 1943. His bomber, part of a formation bound for Hanover, was already limping. The Germans were waiting. The formation had scattered under flak, and fighters were beginning to close in. Morgan's pilot, an older officer named Stanley Rawdon, was flying in the left seat. Morgan was in the right, serving as co-pilot. 10 men, 10 lives, bound to one machine. The first burst of cannon fire came from behind and to the left. A Messerschmitt fighter streaked past, its guns flashing. Bullets ripped through the nose of the bomber, shattering glass and slicing through cables. One round struck the pilot squarely in the head. Rawdon's body jerked violently. Blood sprayed across the cockpit windows. For a moment, he was still alive, eyes open but vacant. His hands, stiff from shock, locked around the control column, pulling it hard to one side. The heavy bomber began to roll. Morgan grabbed the opposite yoke with both hands and fought against the dead weight of a man twice his size. The B-17 was seconds from flipping over. He shouted for help, but the intercom crackled uselessly. The radio was gone. He called again louder, yet the roar of the engines swallowed every sound. With one hand, he tried to pry the pilot's grip from the controls. With the other, he held the yoke steady. His muscles burned. The bomber slowly leveled. Morgan realized the truth. He was now flying the Fortress entirely by himself, holding an unconscious man upright while fending off fighters in hostile airspace. For the next few minutes, his world narrowed to the roar of the engines and the tremor of the wings. He tried to reach for the autopilot switch, but couldn't release the yoke. If he let go for even a second, the plane would roll over and dive. Blood from the wounded pilot smeared his sleeve. Morgan's headset buzzed faintly, but no voices came through. The interphone cable had been severed in the attack. He could not speak to the crew. He had no idea who was alive or dead in the back. The Fortress, nicknamed Ruthie II, was now flying blind. Outside, the sky was filled with streaks of tracer fire. German fighters darted in and out of the clouds, looking for easy kills. Morgan maneuvered as best he could, making wide turns to stay with what was left of the formation. Every vibration, every metallic groan felt like the aircraft's final breath. He had only minutes to decide what to do. He could try to descend and order the men to bail out, but he had no way to give that order. If he left the controls, they would all die. So he held on. Down in the fuselage, the other crewmen were fighting their own battle. The top turret gunner kept firing bursts at the enemy planes, unaware that his pilot was dead and his co-pilot was holding the aircraft alone. The radio operator struggled to send a distress call on damaged equipment. In the waist section, a gunner applied a tourniquet to a wounded friend while smoke seeped in from a ruptured fuel line. The bomber was a flying ruin, but it was still in the air, because Morgan refused to give up. Minutes stretched into an hour. Morgan's arms ached. His right shoulder went numb. He thought of cutting the pilot's harness to move him aside, but Rawdon's stiff hands wouldn't release the yoke. Any wrong motion might send the plane into a deadly spiral. So he stayed locked in that position, half standing, half sitting, his right arm straining against the weight of another man, keeping the wings level through sheer willpower. The sweat froze on his face in the thin, cold air. His vision blurred, but he kept flying. At some point, the fighter attacks faded. The formation, battered and scattered, began to pull away from enemy territory. The damaged bomber lagged behind, engines coughing. Morgan risked glancing at the gauges. Oil pressure was dropping fast. Two engines were bleeding power, and the fuel gauges danced wildly. He didn't know how far they could make it, but turning back to England was their only chance. He eased the nose westward, feeling the plane respond sluggishly. In the rear, the crew finally realized that something was terribly wrong in the cockpit. One man crawled forward through the narrow passage and opened the hatch behind Morgan. What he saw froze him. The pilot was slumped over, blood covering his face, and Morgan was holding him off the controls with one hand while steering with the other. The co-pilot shouted above the noise, telling the man to get back and help the others. There was nothing anyone could do here. Morgan was the only thing keeping the plane alive. Hours passed like that. The weather worsened. Clouds closed in and turbulence shook the damaged airframe. Morgan could barely feel his hands. His mind drifted in and out of clarity. But each time the plane shuddered, instinct brought him back. He had promised himself one thing. As long as the B-17 stayed in the air, he would keep fighting at home. The lives of 9 men depended on it. When the coast of the North Sea finally appeared beneath the broken clouds, it felt unreal. They had crossed the front lines. The worst of the flak was behind them. Morgan forced his aching arms to make small corrections, trimming the engines to keep them balanced. He could see fuel streaming from the left wing, a shimmering line against the sky. Any spark could ignite it. But there was no choice except to keep going. Morgan guided the crippled bomber inland. The English countryside was hidden under a low ceiling of clouds, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. The other crew members were exhausted, some wounded, but they stayed at their guns and windows, ready to assist if the fighters returned. Morgan's left leg was cramping from the hours of strain. The muscles in his shoulders screamed every time he moved the controls. The B-17 was descending steadily, its engines sputtering, the oil pressure warning lights glowing faintly red. He scanned the horizon until he spotted what he thought might be an airfield. Smoke rose from one corner where earlier bombers had landed with damaged engines. He eased the nose lower. The altimeter wound down far too quickly. They were losing altitude faster than he liked. A voice came through the intercom at last. One of the gunners had repaired a section of the cable. "We're over the coast," someone shouted. "We can make it, sir." Morgan couldn't answer. He didn't have the strength to push the transmit button while holding the control yoke steady. He started the approach. The left wing dipped sharply as an engine coughed and died. He corrected, coaxing the other 3 engines to keep them level. The airspeed fell. He had no idea if the landing gear was even functional. He reached for the switch and felt the lever resist. Then a jarring thump told him at least one wheel had locked into place. Good enough. The runway rushed toward them through haze and smoke. At the last second, the wounded pilot's body lurched forward again, twisting the controls in Morgan's hands. The plane yawed violently to one side. Morgan bit down on his lip and pulled back hard, countering the movement just before they touched the ground. The bomber hit the runway in a shower of sparks, bounced once, then settled. Tires burst, and one engine caught fire. Morgan cut power and slammed the fuel switches closed. The Fortress slid to a stop and a scream of metal and smoke. For a moment, there was only silence. Then voices filled the intercom. Cheers, sobs, disbelief. Crewmen poured out of the fuselage and onto the runway. Ground crews rushed forward with fire extinguishers. Morgan sat frozen at the controls, his hands still locked on the yoke. When they pulled him from the cockpit, his arms were swollen and cramped, and his flight jacket was soaked with sweat and blood that wasn't his. He had held the controls for nearly 2.5 hours without relief. Medics carried the pilot away. He would not survive his wound, but the rest of the crew did. 9 men owed their lives to a single decision made high above Germany, to keep flying no matter what it cost. When Morgan finally spoke again hours later, He downplayed everything. He said he had just done his job, that any man in his position would have done the same. His crew didn't agree. They told everyone what they had witnessed, the way he had kept the bomber level, the endless hours he spent holding the controls, the moment he refused to give up when every rational choice said to bail out. Word spread quickly across the base and up through the command chain. Weeks later, Morgan stood at attention as he received the Medal of Honor, one of the few ever awarded to a bomber pilot. The citation read that he displayed superb airmanship, outstanding courage, and devotion to duty. He would later fly again, returning to the skies over Europe, despite the toll the mission had taken on his body. In interviews after the war, Morgan rarely spoke about medals or glory. He spoke about the crew, men who trusted one another completely, who fought side by side in the cold, thin air of those missions. He said that the only thing that mattered up there was keeping everyone alive. The story of Lieutenant John C. Morgan is more than a tale of skill or luck. It's about the quiet strength of a man who refused to surrender, even when trapped in the cockpit of a dying aircraft. It's about endurance, loyalty, and a kind of courage that doesn't shout or boast. It simply acts. In a war defined by destruction, his act of persistence became a small but shining reminder of what humanity looks like at its best. As the years passed, his name joined the list of those who turned impossible situations into stories of survival and honor. His flight in the summer of 1943 remains one of the most remarkable moments in aviation history. A man holding a bomber together through sheer determination, carrying his friends home through fire and fear. If you made it this far into the story, please consider subscribing. It helps us share more true stories like this one.